Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely. If you are listening in the background right now, please give us just a second of your undivided attention. Listeners, the Partnership for Clean Competition has an important announcement before we get started today. The next deadline for anti-doping research funding from the PCC is November 1st. Don't worry, though, the only thing due that day is a short pre-application. You'll have another month to work on your full grant application. There are no maximum or minimum amounts for grant applications, though the average funding amount is about $200,000 US. The PCC has funded more than 100 projects from nearly 20 countries worldwide. Approximately 30% of applicants are awarded PCC funding. So if you've got a clean sport research project and you could use some funding, please go to cleancompetition.org to learn more. The PCC encourages applicants to submit their pre-applications early because they are sending invitations to submit full grant applications as these pre-applications are coming in. So the sooner you get your pre-application in, the sooner you'll be notified about whether you are invited to submit the full application. Again, listeners, the deadline for pre-applications is November 1st, and you can read more at cleancompetition.org. Now, listeners, in this episode today, we are joined by our guest, Dr. Annette Salmeen. Annette was a 1996 Olympian and gold medalist in swimming. In 2005, she was unelected as an athlete member of the United States Anti-Doping Agency, or USADA's, Board of Directors, and she served on the USADA Board until 2012. Currently, Annette is a lecturer and core course coordinator in the Human Biology program at Stanford University, but she is joining us today because she's also a member of the Partnership for Clean Competition's Scientific Advisory Board. She's here to talk to us about best practices in applying for anti-doping research grants from the PCC. So, Annette, we are so excited to have you with us today. Thank you for being on the show. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Well, we are delighted to learn from you today and to chat with you about PCC grants. But can you start by giving our listeners a little bit more detail about yourself and about your current roles?
Sure. As you mentioned, I was an athlete in the sport of swimming. I still swim, although less than I used to. And I'm here today as a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the Partnership for Clean Competition, or the PCC. The Scientific Advisory Board reviews anti-doping grants that are submitted to the PCC. And in my full-time work, I work in undergraduate education in the program in human biology at Stanford.
Fantastic. So I have to ask, how did you find your way from being an athlete in swimming to getting involved with anti-doping kind of on a broader scale?
So when I retired from swimming after the Olympics, I was interested in both staying connected with the sport and also giving back to the sport and staying involved. So I was studying at the time for my PhD in biochemistry and also served as an athlete's representative on a number of committees within USA Swimming. It was clear to me that doping was one of the big challenges and also one of the threats to just the joy of competition that I had been able to experience. So given the combination of my experiences as an athlete and also my background in scientific training and also involvement in some of the sports governance organizations, anti-doping was sort of a natural fit of something to become involved in. And so, as you mentioned in the introduction, I was nominated as an athlete's representative on the board of USADA, the United States Anti-Doping Agency, and I served several terms on the USADA board.
Oh, wonderful. So what was it like serving on the USADA board, kind of seeing things from the other side?
I learned a lot from that experience. And I think I came to appreciate a lot more some of the complexity of the issues and some of the challenges of the science and developing a test, but also some of the challenges of really what needs to be done to protect clean athletes. So it was a really eye-opening experience.
Oh, wonderful. So, Annette, I have to ask then too, how did you get connected originally with the Partnership for Clean Competition? And maybe what did it mean to you to actually be chosen then to be part of the PCC's Scientific Advisory Board?
Yeah, thank you. It was really through the work that I did at USADA. So I served on the USADA Research Committee and had the opportunity to attend the USADA annual symposiums. So from those experiences, I met members of the anti-doping community and some of the PCC Scientific Advisory Board members as well. It was an honor to be asked to be able to join the Scientific Advisory Board and also an exciting opportunity to continue to support the efforts to work for clean sport.
That's amazing. So when you were in your swimming career, did you anticipate that this would potentially be a direction that your career might take? Or is this something where you just saw the opportunities and went with them as they appeared in front of you?
It was probably more that I went with them as the opportunities appeared in front of me. I don't know that I would have quite anticipated it when I was swimming, but I certainly did have an interest in both the sports and the science.
So for people maybe who are less familiar with the PCC, Annette, can you describe the Scientific Advisory Board's role in the PCC's funding?
So when grants are submitted to the PCC, the Scientific Advisory Board reviews those grants. So the Scientific Advisory Board looks at the proposals to look at their scientific merits, and then they make recommendations for funding to the Board of Governors of the PCC, who makes the final decisions about funding.
Excellent. So let's dive into some of the details then, Annette. Can you maybe briefly describe for some of our listeners out there who might not be very familiar, what are some of the funding opportunities that the PCC offers?
The PCC has several different funding mechanisms. There's three main mechanisms: grants, microgrants, and fellowships. Grants give the most flexibility. There's not a set maximum dollar amount or a set time frame. But having a reasonable budget and a realistic timeline, of course, is important when the grant is reviewed. But in general, with grants, if you propose a project, then it can go in and it will get reviewed, and then funding decisions will be made based on the review process. The Partnership for Clean Competition also funds microgrants. These projects need to be less than $75,000 and may not take longer than 6 months. So there's a separate review process for the microgrants so they can be funded more quickly. The PCC also funds fellowships, and fellowships are provided to fund promising scientists that are looking to establish themselves in the field of anti-doping. And the Scientific Advisory Board also reviews fellowship proposals.
Excellent. And you mentioned in terms of the timeline for a project for the microgrants, the project has to be less than 6 months. What would be a reasonable timeline for the larger grant?
I think generally larger grants take 1 to 2 years, but they may take longer. Sometimes difficult to know, depends on the scope of the project.
Gotcha. So what do you specifically look for then when you're reviewing this pile of grants or fellowship applications in front of you? What are the ones that really stand out, or what things help make certain applications rise to the top of the pile?
One of the first things that I look for in the applications is whether the grant poses a clear question, and if the question is relevant to the research priorities and the mission of the PCC. In other words, that the grant has an impact in anti-doping research. And for those of you who might be interested, the research priorities are listed on the PCC webpage if you would want to take a look at those. The background and the introduction should demonstrate both the relevance of the project to anti-doping, but also convey how the project is going to build on current knowledge. So it should demonstrate some understanding of what has been done previously in the particular area. The methodology should be laid out clearly for each step. That's all the way from the sample collection, if the project involves collecting samples, through to the analysis. It can be helpful if there's preliminary data demonstrating the feasibility of the methodology. If preliminary data isn't available, one option might be to apply for a microgrant to receive funding to collect preliminary data. Throughout the proposal, safety and ethics should definitely be considered, and IRB approval certainly needs to be obtained for any human subjects research.
And I guess in terms of the institution or the investigator, are there specific things that really stand out? I know the PCC funding is not just isolated to the United States.
Right. So the PCC does fund grants internationally. So institutions from across the world, as well as anti-doping labs, are welcome to apply for PCC grants.
Excellent. Another thing to point out might be the career stage for grants versus fellowships versus microgrants, if there's any differences. Do you want to comment on that as well?
Sure. Yeah, I think part of the fellowships is often working with a mentor and getting experience in anti-doping labs. So I think that would tend to be people that are starting out a little bit earlier on and interested in getting experience in anti-doping labs. Although I think it would also be open if somebody was looking to a shift into anti-doping. So I think that's also a possibility. And then grants and microgrants would be more for established investigators, although certainly new investigators are welcome for those grants as well.
Absolutely. And I think not just necessarily people often think of established investigators as investigators established within a particular field. But in this case, PCC is very open to people who are established researchers, but new perhaps to anti-doping or adding a new anti-doping element to the research that they do. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I think that is an important part of the PCC, that we might have investigators that have worked a lot in anti-doping, but we're also encourage investigators that work in different fields to apply or have an interest in applying their backgrounds to anti-doping. And I think that is an exciting opportunity for the PCC to bring in new investigators who may be working in a field that has applications in anti-doping. So those types of applications are certainly encouraged and invited.
Oh, wonderful. So I'd love to dive into some of the details about what kinds of fields are applicable for these grants. I think anti-doping is so broad. There are so many different areas within this big umbrella term. So Annette, can you give us a little bit more detail about your own scientific background and maybe the types of research projects that the PCC is funding or looking to fund?
So my background specifically is in biochemistry. I studied protein structures, and I also did work in cell and systems biology, so studying cell signaling pathways. But the PCC funds a range of research projects, and members of the Scientific Advisory Board have backgrounds in different scientific areas. Some of those include analytical chemistry, certainly biochemistry and cell biology are certainly areas. The PCC also has new grants in the social sciences as well.
Fantastic. So I guess when you're looking across time at who's been a successful grant application or what applications have been successful, are there common elements that you really see consistently over and over again?
I think successful proposals have many of the elements that I mentioned in the previous question. I'll just emphasize some of those again. Like, they're very clear, they have feasible methodology and relevance to the PCC mission. One thing I'll add is that I think sometimes collaborations, for example, between those with expertise in anti-doping or those with expertise in particular methodologies, those can really strengthen grant proposals. So sometimes collaborations can also be really helpful as well.
Fantastic. And I guess in terms of successful fellowship applications, is there anything different that you see, or is it pretty similar with kind of the overall grant application success features?
I think it's very similar for fellowship applications as well. I think an important part of fellowship applications is also connecting with a mentor and having talked with them and having a plan for how the fellow will learn in the time that they're doing the fellowship.
Excellent. And I guess on the other side of the coin then, Annette, are there common pitfalls or things that you see people doing in their applications that are not particularly helpful as you're reviewing them and discussing them in the group there?
Sure. So I think one thing that can happen is perhaps an experimental plan might lack detail or a good description of the methodology. And a good thing about that is that's something that somebody can change or revise and think through a project more carefully and then build an experimental plan with more detail. So that would be one thing. There might be elements of a plan, even if a plan is fairly detailed in some parts, there might be parts of the plan that are not well thought out. For example, methods that may have sample sizes that are too small, or a study population that isn't sufficiently diverse for the particular study that's being proposed, or attempting to make measurements that don't sufficiently consider natural variability. Another thing that might come up is having analysis methods that are not clearly explained, or why or how they apply. So those would be some other areas to keep an eye out for in writing the proposals.
Certainly. And I know the members of the Scientific Advisory Board have a broad range of backgrounds and interests and expertise. So can you maybe talk a little bit more about who these members are who will be reviewing and reading these applications?
Yes, I can talk a little bit about that. So we certainly have some members of the Scientific Advisory Board who are experts working in the area of anti-doping. We also have members who may have scientific expertise in particular areas, such as in growth hormone research, EPO research, hematologists, endocrinologists, as well as other areas. The bios for the PCC are available on the website, so you could learn more about the PCC Scientific Advisory Board through the PCC website.
And now I know we mentioned in our introduction that the application deadline for PCC grants is coming up in November. So can you, Annette, walk us through the steps, maybe the timeline of that application and review process for our listeners out there who might be considering submitting?
Sure. The first step in the application process is submitting a pre-application. The pre-applications are relatively short, and they're primarily a way to ensure that grants are on topic for the PCC. So what is required on November 1st is the pre-application. Once a pre-application is approved, then investigators are invited to submit a full application. That the deadline for that is on December 1st. This is where the full grant is where details need to be provided. The Scientific Advisory Board will then review the grants and hold a meeting to form recommendations for the Board of Governors, who will ultimately decide where to direct the funding. Last year, the SAB meeting took place in about January, so that was the timeline that we had in place in the past.
So for people out there who maybe aren't successful the first time, are they able to resubmit for the same project, or they have to come up with a new project if they're interested in applying again?
Yeah, so some projects will maybe encouraged to resubmit, and projects may need different degrees of revision. So there may be a project that needs to be really rethought from the beginning, but there may be projects that get feedback that there could be some small changes that might make it more applicable for funding.
Excellent. Well, you've shared a lot of great information for us. So if there's a listener out there who's on the fence, what is one piece of advice for someone who's considering applying to funding from the PCC that you would give them?
So the first thing I would say is to conduct a thorough literature search and really learn about the efforts that have been made or underway to the proposed study. And then to get some feedback from a trusted colleague, maybe somebody with a slightly different scientific background, to get some constructive feedback, or consider finding a collaborator who could complement your areas of expertise. But mostly make sure that the proposal is clear, write it in advance of the deadline and read it and revise it.
Excellent advice. And I'm curious, I know the PCC is funding projects across a wide range of topics, but for you personally, not necessarily as a representative of the PCC here, but just as an expert in these fields of science, what is maybe something going on right now in anti-doping that you think is a really exciting or promising research area?
So as I mentioned in the beginning, some of my interest is in systems biology. And I think there's a lot of exciting areas where we're able to make measurements in these large scale gene expression measurements or metabolomic studies. So one thing I'm excited to see is how some of these newer technologies might be able to be used in anti-doping.
Phenomenal. Well, it's been great to chat about these topics. And I know there's so much exciting research going on in anti-doping today, but oftentimes resources are a limitation. The PCC certainly helps with these funding opportunities. But Annette, if we took away all the barriers you normally face and you had all of the resources in the world, is there one particular problem in anti-doping that you would want to solve most?
I think I would really be most interested in looking at how do we prevent doping, trying to understand why athletes make the decision to dope, who influences them, and really thinking about how we can do more to build sports communities that promote athlete health and wellness and clean sport. And I think that's one of the things that some of the social science areas that are being funded now, that's an area that is being considered as well by the PCC.
Oh, that's wonderful. And maybe one more question, if I may. Obviously, anti-doping is an evolving field. Things are constantly changing. Is there one thing that you feel like has really improved or changed in anti-doping from your days as an athlete to where we are now?
I do think that being able to submit the athlete forms online and having the technology to communicate, that has come a long way. So some of the ability to communicate, I think, is an area that has changed a lot.
Well, it sounds like we've made great strides, at least on that front, and we are continuing to make advances in anti-doping. So if people want to learn more about the PCC and its funding opportunities to be part of the history that we're building here, where should they go?
So the PCC webpage is a great resource for all of these funding opportunities, and that's where they can find the applications, and that's at cleancompetition.org.
Excellent. And then how do people submit their applications? Is it on the website?
The website has the instructions on how to submit the application, yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Annette, so much for sharing your expertise, talking about the Scientific Advisory Board, and sharing these wonderful grant opportunities with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's been a pleasure to chat with you. Listeners, great to have you here as well. Definitely check out the PCC's website to learn more about these funding opportunities. And if you are not necessarily a good fit for the funding opportunities, keep in mind that you can forward these to anyone that you know who's in science, who's doing research that might potentially be applicable to anti-doping. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on another episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.